Center of the George Floyd case say they can finally take a breath. Former police officer Derek Chauvin has been found guilty of murder and manslaughter in the death of their loved one. The verdict prompted celebrations across the United States, as well as calls for more change to the justice system. Now, the conviction was an emotional experience for many Black Americans who have watched too many lives lost at the hands of police, some calling it a profound step toward racial justice. Here to discuss this historic moment and really what comes next is Rashawn Ray, professor of sociology from the University of Maryland. Rashawn, we appreciate you joining us. Obviously, an emotional day for so many people. I want to begin with your reaction. You've been watching this every step of the way. You're the father of two young boys, especially. What does this mean for you?
Well, look, I think this case is what should have happened. It was a slam dunk from the beginning. But what people were wondering is whether or not the ball they saw go in the net was actually going to count on the scoreboard. And let me be clear, this case is an exemplar, but an outlier. It is not the norm. Every year in the United States, over 1,000 people are killed by the police, and rarely are officers ever charged or convicted. In fact, there have been less than 10 cases in pretty much the last 15 years where an officer was convicted of a charge higher than manslaughter. So this should have happened, but because of racism in the United States, people wondered whether or not the justice system would get it right.
Now, you mentioned some of these individuals, and just recently in Minneapolis as well, Daunte Wright, Breonna Taylor, of course, Daniel Prude in Rochester, Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy in Cleveland, Matiana Jefferson in Texas. There are so many cases, of course. And if it wasn't for the video in this case, do you think anything would have been done?
I don't think so. I think the video evidence was important, and it's important for people to know why this case was an exemplar. The video evidence, particularly this particular image, shot by a 17-year-old girl who witnessed something and saw that something was wrong and took action, which is not what the other police officers did. We also know that because the case was scaled up to the state level, part of what happened is that Keith Ellison was able to assemble an all-star cast. The other thing we know is that the jury was extremely diverse, and there were a slew of medical professionals and police officers testifying against Chauvin. That does not typically happen.
Now, this has been described as a watershed case, even before the verdict. What does this verdict mean now for real change?
Well, look, I think this case was a litmus test on race relations in the United States, because if you can't get a conviction in this case, what does that say about America? And I think people oftentimes know the answer to that question. Now, this is an individual case where one individual was prosecuted. It does not change policy. But George Floyd's murder and what people saw on video has galvanized broader policy change. At the federal level, we know that the House of Representatives passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. That is extremely important, but now it has to pass the Senate. It removes qualified immunity, which is the court's doctrine that prevents police officers from being sued. So right now, even though Chauvin was convicted criminally, he faces no civil penalty. That $27 million comes from taxpayers. We need to shift that to police department insurances and police officer liability insurance.
What about some other changes? And, not difficult changes overall, perhaps expensive, but when we're talking about de-escalation techniques, and you compare, and you've compared before, the amount of time that officers are given in firearms training compared to de-escalation training. Elaborate on that and what could be done.
Yes, this is one of the most, I think, depressing stats in law enforcement, that they receive over 50 hours of firearm training when they come through the police academy and less than 10 hours of de-escalation training. That's like one day of training on that. So when they pull their guns and their weapons, when they use tactics, that shouldn't be surprising. So we need to flip that. The other thing we need to do, though, is that we need to train them towards social interactions. We also need to have community oversight boards. The state of Maryland just mandated this for all municipalities, for individuals to have representation on misconduct boards within police departments. And then we also need national and state databases so that bad apples like Chauvin and others, such as Timothy Loman, who killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who had been let go from a previous department from being deemed mentally unstable, that they cannot go to another department and actually engage in the type of misconduct that we saw against George Floyd.
Now, there are people who say, look, this is just a case of bad apples. We've seen many cases like this before. You take this further, that this is part of a rotten tree policy in many ways, and systemic racism, not just in the United States, but really we're seeing all over the world. So there's the watershed moments, but in order to have real change, you need the sea change of not bad apples. We've seen many cases
deemed mentally unstable, that they cannot go to another department and actually engage in the type of misconduct that we saw against George Floyd.
Now, there are people who say, look, this is just a case of bad apples. We've seen many cases like this before. You take this further, that this is part of a rotten tree policy in many ways, and systemic racism, not just in the United States, but really we're seeing all over the world. So there's the watershed moments, but in order to have real change, you need the sea change of not just policy, but behavior and beliefs as well. Would you agree?
I mean, without a doubt. Look, it's unclear right now if culture is
tree
and actually engage in the type of misconduct that we saw against George Floyd.
Now, there are people who say, look, this is just a case of bad apples. We've seen many cases like this before. You take this further, that this is part of a rotten tree policy in many ways, and systemic racism, not just in the United States, but really we're seeing all over the world. So there's the watershed moments, but in order to have real change, you need the sea change of not just policy, but behavior and beliefs as well. Would you agree?
I mean, without a doubt. Look, it's unclear right now if culture is reformable. But one thing we know is that you cannot change culture unless you change structure and policy. As I've written about, bad apples come from rotten trees and policing. And one thing we know is that those rotten trees are oftentimes imbued with white supremacy ideology. We also know that good apples then get swallowed up by the rotten tree. They become poisoned. They get pushed out. They inadvertently engage in misconduct. They also witness it and don't intervene because the blue wall of silence is set up not to crack, and there are penalties for trying to do so. So look, we have to make changes to protect good officers. Good officers simply do not push out bad apples. Instead, we have to focus on the system, and that is part of not only addressing policing, but the criminal justice system as a whole.
Rashawn Ray, we appreciate your time and your insight.